Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 20, The Long 7th Century, Part 1. Last time, we talked about the prophet Isaiah, cultic purity, and we said farewell to the 8th century BCE with a bang, as King Sennacherib, who'd gained the throne after his father's humiliating disappearance in Anatolia, reconquered all of the rebellious provinces and vassals of the Assyrian Empire. He plowed through Syria, Lebanon, and the Levant, deciding Jerusalem and its defenses weren't worth the time, as Judahite King Hezekiah, one of the Bible's most venerated monarchs, emptied the capital of all its silver, gold, and anything else worth much. Judah, briefly ascendant, was now at a low. Sennacherib, who was something of a Lothario and horror of horrors, really loved one of his wives, made a younger son of hers, Esarhaddon, the crown prince. The former crown prince and his family were incensed by this. They conspired to assassinate Sennacherib, and after his father's death, Esarhaddon had to fight to take the crown, which he did successfully. Meanwhile, Judah, in its nadir, spent the rest of Hezekiah's reign keeping their heads down. While Hezekiah exhibited some kind of Egyptophilia in culture, he doesn't seem to have made any further, at least outright gestures towards the Egyptians, and frankly, the political history of the majority of the 7th century becomes fairly boring in Judah. Sennacherib's campaign of destruction and reorganization had its intended effect, and so despite the geopolitical chaos that will unfold throughout the ancient Middle East, it won't be until the Great War of the last quarter of the century that things will truly begin to heat up in Judah again. Jerusalem had been successfully cowed, and the devastation of its cities and military outposts in former splendor, combined with the increased tribute payments demanded by Nineveh, kept it from becoming a true threat. Hezekiah died after a reign of 20 to 30 years. It's uncertain where his reign began and when it ended, sometime in the 690s, probably. His son Manasseh took the Jerusalem throne a few years before Sennacherib's death, give or take, and his staggeringly long reign and infamous legacy will mostly be the subject of the second part of this series, though I'll get into it a bit today. Folks, this next run of episodes is going to be kind of bonkers. To start with, this is a kind of 3-part mini-series that covers Assyria and Judah during the reigns of Esarhaddon and his son Ashurbanipal, who will reign for a long time, several decades. From there, we will be proceeding headlong into the rise of Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem. I may take a bit of a break once we hit the exile, as I'm moving back to America, and well, that's quite an undertaking, but I will continue posting bonus content at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast, where you can support the show. If I do end up taking a bit of a break, this would be a great time for you to share the show with friends and family and get more folks in on the Bible lore train. Lots of time to get caught up. Anyway, housekeeping over, let's get into it. The main sources for this episode are Eckhart Fromm's Assyria, Francesca Stavrakopoulou's King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, and a fair bit from the Oxford History of the Ancient Near East, Volume 4. As always, these and all other sources will be listed in the episode description. Despite Stavrakopoulou's book having a spicy title, it will actually be the next episode that covers the whole child sacrifice thing. Because before we get into the brutal realities and wild distortions of that most horrid of practices, we need to talk about Assyrian King Esarhaddon's reign, as it's his imperial machinations and his quest to ensure that his own son's succession is not a repeat of his own chaotic journey to the crown that will inadvertently help form one of the most interesting ideologies in the Hebrew Bible, a text that was initially created for his vassal kingdoms to ensure a smooth transition of his crowned prince will be reworked to become a treaty between Judah and their God instead. The long 7th century BCE, from Samaria's fall in 722 to the 580s, is the true beginning of parts of the Bible as a text, with some of the early prophets and parts of the Torah showing, for the first time, demonstrable roots in this century. Let me expand on that a bit. The early Iron Age, the centuries before our current period, forms the background context for a lot of mythology in the Bible. I've divided the show up in this way because of it, starting a bit with the late Bronze Age that gets distant, faint echoes in mythology, and whose cataclysmic end establishes the emergence of the Iron Age political situation. The Iron Age then forms much more of the actual backdrop of several of the early biblical texts, as well as the history found in Kings. And the cultic side of the Iron Age creates a backdrop as well. The way Yahweh is thought about as a storm deity, married to Asherah, the divine consort of El before him, one of his primary predecessors, his similarities to and conflict with Baal, his close cousin and one of his primary inspirations, his creation lore of fighting the sea dragon, mostly left out of the Torah, but present in the poetry of the Psalms and Prophets. Yahweh is a god worshipped in a Phoenician-style temple, fed sacrificial food and libations and other offerings. The mythical status of kings in political events that are based in this early Iron Age period. All of this stuff is in the Iron Age, and it's not just the biblical texts that find their roots here. From King David to the Iliad to Semiramis and beyond, the early Iron Age gains a specific mythical quality beyond even just the realm of deities in the Bible. And it's also a fuzzy transitional time where the gods were thought to still interact in specific ways that will become less foregrounded as we go on. In the past, either decades or centuries or millennia ago, gods directly intervened and sometimes even revealed themselves in the material world. Less so when it comes to the present moment, where contemporary records are more plentiful. Curious how that always happens. Anyway, a major shift in this transformation is the century of Assyrian domination, the time we're in right now. And this is a period whose cataclysmic end does not spell another broad societal collapse like the Bronze Age did with its widespread patterns of destruction and breakdown. Nineveh is, shockingly, about to be completely destroyed, along with its ruling elites and its existence as a state. But this will instead be a time of imperial continuity, because Babylon will take over from Assyria, and then Persia takes over from Babylon, and then Alexander and his successors take over from them, and onto the Romans and the Byzantines and the Holy Roman Empire, and frankly, to some extent or another, down to today. To paraphrase the great Philip K. Dick, the Assyrian Empire never really ended. There are regressions and periods of retraction and vacuums and shifts in the center of power, but we've never fully left Nineveh. Someone else has always just taken up the reins and perhaps moved camp somewhere else. So whatever hope that Babylon would prove to be a harbinger of Judahite independence will be quickly dashed on the rocks of empire, as a series of ill-advised rebellions by the kings of Jerusalem will give us the Judahite state's complete collapse and destruction. This will intriguingly not spell an end to Judahite identity either, however, but the cataclysmic exile will instead become a key theme in the biblical texts and in a resurgence of this identity and its subsuming into a new political entity in Greek-era Judea. And so even today, we carry with us, because of all of these and later consequences, the influence of the cultures and texts of the Bible, many of which began taking shape in the long 7th century, where the political situation slowly comes to a simmer before completely boiling over as the Middle East enters a decades-long war. This is a complex and fascinating history, one that takes place in a time where the political history of Judah has still largely been lost to us. Before it all rapidly came crashing down, this was a mostly peaceful time for them, meaning an unfortunate lack of contemporary sources or interest in the period for us. The fall of Samaria, the siege of Jerusalem, the disastrous rebellions of the last few kings of Judah, those all get written extensively about. But King Manasseh's half-century reign, where Judah mostly was a loyal vassal, that doesn't put asses in seats, I guess. This is why this little mini-series focusing on Assyria and Manasseh has to lean more on the Assyrian side of things and relegate much of our history of Manasseh to discussions of his later legacy that's shaped by a couple of key biblical authors. So, when we last left Judah, we were at a serious crossroads of what the Bible claims and what the historical record demonstrates. Sennacherib had retreated from Jerusalem, that much is clear. The Bible claims two things, though. Most prominently, that Yahweh's executioners slaughtered nearly 200,000 Assyrian troops and caused the remaining Assyrians to flee, but also briefly mentioned before that instead Hezekiah merely emptied Jerusalem of its wealth to pay Sennacherib off. It's this latter portrait of a massive conciliatory payment that aligns with what scholars have gleaned from Assyrian records and archaeology. But the crossroads doesn't end here, and this gets into one of the main sources for this woefully understudied period, Stavrakopoulou's King Manasseh and child sacrifice. Manasseh reigns for over 4 decades, but there's almost nothing written about him in Kings, our earliest source, and all of what is written in the Bible is dealing with theological and ideological concerns within Judah itself, something where these accounts are often particularly ahistorical. The main issue is that Manasseh will be blamed for the fall of Jerusalem, and then that blame will create theological contradictions, which require first a rebuttal by the prophet Jeremiah, and then a rewrite of the king's account in the book of Chronicles to fix this issue. The issue, of course, is who's to blame? Who do we blame for Jerusalem falling? Who do we blame for the temple being destroyed? Manasseh's legacy continued to be an interesting set of contradictions deep into the medieval period, because Judah didn't fall under his reign, and that was a problem. The earliest accounts had no issue with blaming him, an earlier king, for the sins and destruction of the future, but it would prove to be a philosophical problem for those who considered individual free will to be important to Yahweh. I mean, how could a just God punish all of these people for the mistakes of one man, let alone just one king who died decades before the cataclysmic event happened? As always, the relationship between God and time becomes a serious theological issue to be argued about. We'll get into all of that more, but who was Manasseh really? I'll be discussing the child sacrifice elephant in the room next time, but if we pull back from this salacious detail, an interesting picture emerges in the Deuteronomistic history. While Manasseh is the longest reigning king of Judah, the way his story is even told is kind of bizarre. The main issue is that the entire passage is essentially just a summary form. There are no real stories in it. With Hezekiah, we got like 4 different stories, with the king as a character who experiences pain and distress upon the destruction of his lands by Sennacherib. Manasseh, despite his place of prominence, doesn't get that at all. Unlike Ahab, who he's modeled after, the whole passage is formulaic and removed. He gets the standard intro that says when his reign started, how long he ruled for, and so on, but then instead of going into a story with characters and emotions and quotes from characters, as we see in many of his peers who rule for decades, like Ahab and Jeroboam and Hezekiah and his grandson Josiah, the telling of his time as king just proceeds with the description of his misdeeds from an outsider's perspective looking back. I'll read it out here in full. It's from 2 Kings 21. Quote, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, following the abominable practices of the nations that Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal. He made a sacred pole, as King Ahab of Israel had done. Worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, In Jerusalem I will put my name. He built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of Yahweh. He made his son pass through the fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury and dealt with mediums and with wizards.
Wizard, you shall not pass!
He did much evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. The carved image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house of which Yahweh said to David and to his son Solomon, In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen. Manasseh misled them to do more evil than the nations had done that Yahweh destroyed before the people of Israel. So that's the sort of generic, if long, summary of why Manasseh is the baddest of bad guys. But then we finally get to the central argument of the book of Kings. This is the climax. Quote, Yahweh said by his servants, the prophets, because King Manasseh of Judah has committed these abominations, has done things more wicked than all that the Amorites who were before him did, and has caused Judah also to sin with his idol. Therefore thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such evil that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line for Samaria, and the plummet for the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger, since the day their ancestors came out of Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides the sin that he caused Judah to sin, so that they did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. So it's a uniquely long summary, but it reads as essentially recounting his failures and sins from a scorecard while not adding any literary flair that we've become accustomed to at this point, besides the quotes from Yahweh. I mean, even kings like Ahab and Jeroboam get their day in the sun. But the closest Manasseh comes is essentially being accused of doing all of their crimes and more. It's like a summary statement. Instead, Manasseh is given this distinctive long list of horrible crimes, from reinstating worship of Baal after Hezekiah's fictional reforms to supposedly passing his son, quote, through the fire, something that is broadly accepted as a reference to sacrificing his own child to a god. Even this grisly detail does not merit, in the author's mind, a story like Misha's desperate sacrificing of his son on the walls in the story of Moab's rebellion. I mean, the son's not named in Manasseh's case, and we don't even know why he does it. It's just this isolated incident, completely stripped out of giving any kind of context whatsoever. It's just a list of crimes off a sheet. Instead, this all serves the theological point of this passage, a point of intense focus. That is, why Jerusalem is about to be destroyed, some 60 or so years after Manasseh's death. The epic of Jerusalem's devastation needed a villain, and for reasons I'll get into in the next episode, Manasseh became the perfect scapegoat. But to understand the whole picture and how the political volcano would finally erupt in the late 7th century, we need to talk about Manasseh more in the context of the Assyrian administrations he dealt with in the first half of his reign, between the 790s and the early 760s. The start of Manasseh's reign is itself extremely hard to pin down, as is the question of whether he had a co-regency with his father, Hezekiah. If he did rule alongside his most blessed of fathers, he would have seen his dad humbled by the Assyrian campaign into Judah, as this once promising king was reduced to being a pliant vassal. Sometime between the early 690s and the early 680s, though, Hezekiah died, and a few years later, Sennacherib died as well. We have no indications that the likely still young Manasseh had any inclination toward rebelling against Nineveh the way that his father had done. Perhaps, if he lived through the 690s, Hezekiah had taught his young son that Assyria was not a force to be trifled with. And so we end up with our new Assyrian king, Esarhaddon. Despite having to immediately fight off his brother's forces to secure his right to rule after they'd assassinated Sennacherib, the new king was no lightweight. His father's advisors had trained him in military strategy and imperial management in ways befitting a crown prince. One advisor's letter, which has survived the period, gives him some rudimentary advice. Quote, "The king, my lord, should not get close to the fighting. Just as your royal fathers have done, stay on the hill and let your magnates do the fighting." Smart. It paid off, because despite ruling for just over a decade, and while he would always stay far away from the battles, Esarhaddon left his fingerprints all over the rest of the century, and indeed, indirectly, over the rest of world history up to this point. Right off the bat, and under his mother Nakia's watchful eye, Esarhaddon was forced to deal with a crisis. The legendary city of to the south, where one day Abram himself will be said to originate from, was besieged by the Elamites of western Iran, who were centered on the eastern banks of the Persian Gulf, frankly not too far a journey from The Elamites and several other peoples of modern Iran will continue to be a problem for Assyria and then their Babylonian successors. Keep an eye to the east, lads. For now, though, the Assyrian king proved more than capable to kick the Elamites out. A few more years into his reign, Esarhaddon faced another major challenge to his authority, this time in the west from the powerful Phoenician trading city of Sidon, who attempted to rid themselves of vassalage, but instead ended up merely inviting a brutal siege that may have lasted well over a year. It's hard to besiege cities on the coast if you don't have a significant navy, so cut the Assyrians a bit of slack. Manasseh watched all of this and probably breathed a sigh of relief that he'd chosen to continue paying tribute. After subduing Sidon and handing much of the city's territory to their neighborly rivals in Tyre, Esarhaddon made his way back east, having achieved the kind of victory his father would have been proud of. A further campaign into eastern Anatolia, however, was far less successful, and the Assyrian king experienced his first taste of frustration and defeat. A couple years later, around 675, he warred against the Elamites again, this time closer to their own turf. He also warred against Urartu to the north and northeast in Armenia, establishing a decent eastern and northern moat to ensnare typical pests of the Assyrian Empire. Military outposts were built up to ensure quick responses to any eastern threat, and these were supplemented by spy networks too. The guy was a regular Nixon. He was notoriously paranoid. But Esarhaddon also knew when to cut deals. He managed to make peace with some of the Arab tribes to the south, whose bandits always made managing the southern borders another gnat in the king's faces. The Arabs were a fascination to the Assyrians, as they were largely nomadic and oasis-bound people who could manage constant traversal of the vast southern deserts. Large parts of the previous century saw some of these Arabs ruled by a number of women monarchs, something that had only occasionally happened throughout the Bronze Age in the broader Middle East, with women being in some ways more subjugated and limited in the societal roles available to them over the course of the previous couple thousand years. Our sources are sparse, but there does seem to have been some kind of less rigid or at least different gender structuring of society that was slowly pushed aside as these kingdoms grew larger and certain ideologies took hold. But the Arabs were almost like a living fossil of that older time. Curiously, Frahm notes that during the 8th and 7th centuries, some women began to play larger roles in Assyrian politics, perhaps being influenced by the Arabs, with the Arabs, on the other hand, reducing the role of women and proceeding to primarily male rule, perhaps reflecting Assyrian influence in the other direction. Esarhaddon's ascension over his older brothers may have been pushed by his own mother, Nakiah, who appears to have continued taking a significant role in politics in the early years of his reign, appearing in various inscriptions even years after her husband had died. And perhaps it was this ambitious woman who influenced her son to seize power like she had, because Esarhaddon had much grander plans than reminding everyone that Assyria was in their prime and most efficient phase. He wanted to widen the borders and take Assyria to new heights, and while we may see it as a Pyrrhic victory, this he very much achieved. Esarhaddon is often viewed as a master of foreign policy who struggled on the domestic front, and that doesn't necessarily seem too far off. He spent some of his early years rebuilding Babylon, which would have sent his father's corpse spinning in its grave as Sennacherib had leveled the city as revenge for their collusion with Elam in a fight for independence, and possibly because they killed his son. But Esarhaddon reversed course, supporting major building projects in the ancient city with the presumed goal of securing Babylonian favor and potentially having a solid ally against the east. The southern part of Mesopotamia around Babylon was more populated and contained more lush agricultural land than the north did, and so Babylon's gods were returned and their temples rebuilt, and their ancient city streets would once again bustle with activity. Of course, Esarhaddon didn't want to truly anger his father's ghost or portray himself as defying his father's will, so he had a propaganda text commissioned that stated that it wasn't Sennacherib, but rather Marduk, the god, who had flooded Babylon and destroyed it because some of the wicked people of the city had looted his temple. Quote, "The canal Araktu, a river in flood, furious current, reproduction of the deluge, was deflected, and its water flowed over the city of his residence and over his own sanctuary, turning everything into a ruin. The gods and goddesses who dwelt there fled away as birds and ascended into heaven. The people who dwelt there passed under the yoke and whip and became slaves. 70 years as measure of the desolation, he wrote in the destiny. But then the merciful Marduk, whose rage lasts a moment, changed it and considered restoration after 11 years. So there's the twist. Marduk the Merciful, after wiping the city out, changed his mind and reduced the exilic period of 70 years down to a much more reasonable 11 years, allowing Esarhaddon to reconstruct the city that the god, not Sennacherib, had destroyed. Something that's fairly distinct about this text, found in what's called the Blackstone inscription, is that it presents itself as a prophecy from the past, what's called ex eventu prophecy. Ex eventu prophecy was not the kind of thing most prophets engaged in during the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, since it relied on writing about the past and later readers finding your quote-unquote predictions convincing. But it became an important part of the biblical texts and later Christian texts, especially books like Daniel. And note the 70-year exile in the Esarhaddon text, because that's going to be an important number when it comes to the Judahite exile and prophecies in books like Daniel and later Revelation. Again, fascinating just how much of the Bible seems to have its roots in the 600s BCE. The 7th century is just a remarkable time period, as this is when Homer and Hesiod's epic poems were probably composed for the first time, when philosopher poets like Xenophanes were around in what would become known as Greece. Sennacherib, Esarhaddon's father, had used Greek mercenaries in their ships to cross the Persian Gulf for a surprise attack on Elam. I use these mercenaries as an example of the globalization that had once again taken root alongside not exactly a Pax Assyria, but certainly a sophisticated, if ruthless, imperial governance and infrastructure. Roads, trade networks, caravans of goods, it was all there. So the Greek mercenaries are a sure sign that we're completely recovered from the Bronze Age collapse. This is a society that was now every bit as complex and far-reaching as the one that fell apart in the 12th century. And once again, Egypt and a Middle Eastern power were about to fight it out. Egypt was going through a tricky period, with revolts from Libya and the north occasionally challenging the positioning of the Nubian rulers from Sudan in Upper Egypt to the south. While these pharaohs made repeated attempts in the 8th century to gain a foothold in the Levant, as they did during Sennacherib's conquest of Judah, it didn't really take. They were successful in their own ways, but they clearly weren't Assyria. Esarhaddon noted their potential threat or challenge or opportunity, however one might portray Egypt from an Assyrian king's perspective in the Iron Age, and his advisors gave him the go-ahead on a campaign into the ancient land. They began planning a grand invasion, securing troops and mercenaries to attack the Nile Delta from the north on what's called the Sea Road, the Way of Horus or the Via Maris, a military road that went from a bit north of Jaffa and Gaza along the Mediterranean coast. This ancient road gets a passing reference in a bizarre and confusing passage in Isaiah 9, or at the end of Isaiah 8 if you're using a Jewish Bible. It comes after a prophecy set in the time of Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, and suddenly in the middle of it, there is a bizarre discussion of ghosts and deified ancestors. Quote, "And should they say to you, inquire of the ghosts and the familiar spirits who chirp and murmur. Shall not a people inquire of its gods from the dead for the living, for instruction and guidance? They indeed shall speak according to this world that has no dawn. And he shall pass through it, stricken and hungry. And it shall happen when he hungers that he shall be infuriated, and curse his king and his gods, and turn his face upward, and to earth look down. And distress and darkness, swooping straits and uttermost gloom." The point here might be that necromancy is an ineffective form of divination, but it also seems to confirm that ghosts and ancestral spirits really do roam the world and cause trouble to the living. Anyway, several commentaries I've looked at note that a lot of the Hebrew here is mangled or unintelligible, and it proceeds in unintelligibility in the last verse of this section. Quote, "For there is no swoop for him in the straits. Now the former has brought disgrace to the land of Zebulun and to the land of Naphtali, and the latter brought honor to the way of the sea, across from Jordan, Galilee of the kingdoms." And that's our one mention of the way of the sea, where it's described in a contextually ambiguous manner, possibly referring to something that happened during the reign of Ahaz, Hezekiah's father. Anyway, the Assyrians set out in late 674 or maybe 673, but regardless of the exact year, the campaign was an unmitigated disaster, one that Esarhaddon barely mentions in his annals, a true embarrassment. If there was one thing that Egypt was good at, it was repelling forces coming through the Via Maris. This was the exact approach they had known the Assyrians or any other Middle Eastern force might attempt to use for many centuries, and Esarhaddon's forces broke like waves on the rocks. The king did not take the defeat well, and if he'd had his struggles before this, the rest of his life would be marked by what can only be described as pretty rough depression or anxiety or PTSD or whatever. Diagnoses of past figures are always fraught, but it's pretty safe to conclude that the man was not well. Perhaps worsening this, it's possible but uncertain that the crown prince died around this time as well, or was for some other reason removed from the line of succession. So that's maybe what is sitting in the background of Esarhaddon's next, extremely consequential move. The presumptive crown prince at this point, regardless of whether he had an elder son or not, was Shama-Shuma-Ukin. Esarhaddon, however, did not put this eldest son in line to succeed the throne of Nineveh.
It is happening again.
Instead, he put Shama-Shuma-Ukin in line to be king of Babylon. Perhaps he didn't trust this older son, or perhaps he really trusted him, because Esarhaddon seemed to have had an intense dedication to rebuilding the ancient city. As his successor in Nineveh and the true ruler of the empire, though, he installed the next son in line, someone whose name you might be a bit more familiar with, Ashurbanipal. Frahm notes a quote from Esarhaddon's chief exorcist about the whole nomination process that perhaps contains a bit of deliberately subtle criticism. Quote, "What has not been done in heaven, my lord, the king has done on earth and shown us. You have donned a younger son of yours with the diadem, and have entrusted to him the king of Assyria. Your elder son, in the meantime, you have set to the kingship of Babylon. You have placed the first on your right and the second on your left side." This whole setup recalls Diocletian's disastrous four-emperor tetrarchy, or some of the other Roman empires who split Rome's imperial holdings between two sons, one in the east and one in the west. It's something that tends to happen in these ancient polities when an empire gets too unwieldy or is spread too thin. And Assyria was getting there. While Ashurbanipal as the northern king and Shama-Shuma-Ukin as the subservient southern king wouldn't collapse quite as fast as Diocletian's scheme, it would still prove too clever by half. We'll get into that when we pick up on Ashurbanipal's reign, though, but for now we'll dive into the intrigue about the setup of this new succession, which is itself a fascinating and monumental topic. Esarhaddon was frustrated by his father's seeming ineffectiveness in putting him in place as the heir apparent, and he was determined to not make the same mistake when it came to his sons and their spots on the thrones. While Sennacherib had made his other sons and a bunch of the royal family and elites in Nineveh swear fealty and pinky promise not to revolt over his unorthodox succession arrangement, Esarhaddon, seeing the failure of that approach, decided to overcorrect, take it to the next level, perhaps 10 levels above. In May of 672, the king made the succession decree official, marking the occasion by inviting many of Nineveh's elites and a tremendous amount of foreign kings and dignitaries to the great capital for a ceremony and likely some wonderfully debauched party to celebrate his new setup. Dozens of kingdoms sent representatives to witness the occasion. It was the kind of imperial event that hadn't been seen since the time of Ahab, when Assyria was first becoming a big regional power, almost 2 centuries earlier. One of the first global summits. That's how important this was to the king. For those state dignitaries in attendance at the festival, many were given individualized copies of the large succession treaty text to take back to their home cities and display for all to see. And for those who couldn't make it or weren't invited to the festivities, copies of the oath text were sent out as far as the reaches of the empire went, even into constant rivals like the kingdoms of Western Iran. There would be no confusion or claim that something unauthorized was going down whenever Esarhaddon died. Everyone knew the king's wishes, and they were all warned about the consequences if they didn't fall in line. A copy of this succession loyalty oath was almost certainly sent to Jerusalem, to the royal court and temple of Manasseh. At the very least, someone in the orbit of the Judahites came into contact with the treaty at some point because, well, the treaty kind of ends up in the Bible, albeit in a wildly different context. What's typically called the Esarhaddon Succession Treaty is of an ancient genre known as the Adai Oath, something that even appears 600 years earlier in a similar format in Hatti. These were oaths sworn before the gods with binding curses that were promised to all of those who violated the terms laid out, and Esarhaddon's take on the genre is one of the longest at well over 600 lines, and also the most widely attested. 8 copies in different scripts have been found in the Elamite regions of western Iran and in several locations in Iraq and Syria. Esarhaddon wanted this thing spread far and wide. Deuteronomy's take on this oath, as repurposed and adapted as it is also accompanied by a ceremony like Esarhaddon's, as described obliquely in chapters 27, where the Israelites are sworn in, so to speak. In the Assyrian version, there's a long introduction, a preamble where Esarhaddon notes his kingly bona fides, his heritage, and his confirmation that this has all been authorized by all of the gods represented by the planets and stars above. But then he gets right to the point, quote, "When Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, passes away, you will seat Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, upon the royal throne, and he will exercise the kingship and lordship of Assyria over you. You shall protect him in country and in town, fall and die for him. You shall speak with him in the truth of your heart, give him sound advice loyally, and smooth his way in every respect. You shall not depose him, nor seat any one of his brothers, elder or younger, on the throne of Assyria instead of him. You shall neither change nor alter the word of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, but serve this very Ashurbanipal, the great crown prince designate, whom Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, your lord, has presented to you, and he shall exercise the kingship and dominion over you." From this point forward, there are fascinating parallels to the book of Deuteronomy especially, including concerns that were very, very particular to Esarhaddon. Deuteronomy is a book that has pretty clear roots in the 7th century, both because of its dependence on this text and also for what appears to be a story of its discovery some 50 years after our present moment, during the reign of Josiah of Judah. We'll cover all of that in a few episodes, but for now, we'll be exploring the ties between Esarhaddon's treaty and this final book of the Torah, a text brimming with laws and ancient poetry. Deuteronomy is also significantly tied into the broader Moses narrative, and much of it is focused on issues related to the exile. So while we can talk about some of the earlier layers of the text, it's important to note that not all of it is from the 7th century, even if the Treaty of Esarhaddon has some pretty straightforward influence visible in the book, particularly passages in the biblical text related to a binding oath between a ruler and his people. Esarhaddon feared that there would be plots against Ashurbanipal, and so he expanded the spire networks, encouraged a bit of tattling on one's peers to ensure that any potential coups directed at him or Ashurbanipal, like the one that had killed his father and sought to depose him, would die in their infancy. Frahm notes that it seems to have worked, as narcs from around the empire commissioned letters and some real plots were almost certainly uncovered, likely in cooperation with the king's intelligence networks. There were also sometimes unhinged false positives like one might expect to receive at a public email address today, including a spectacular rant where the anonymous author accuses a local governor and his wife of engaging in unauthorized witchcraft, and also tattles on their driver for allegedly saying, quote, "Someone bring me an iron knife so I can cut off its point and stick it in the governor's ass." So yeah, it ran into the same kind of shit that likely plagued the America's Most Wanted hotline in the 90s. Like, what the hell does that have to do with the plot against the king or his son? Why are you calling this number?
Hey, how can I help you?
Yeah, you guys have Shrek on DVD?
Shrek?
Yeah.
No, we don't sell DVDs here.
How about Shrek 2?
Talk to the local authorities, we're busy here. One can imagine Esarhaddon's court scribes getting letters from gang-stalking victims who claimed they knew the king was out to get them and was using mind power to ruin their lives. But anyway, the text also describes how to handle cases where diviners either gave or were pressured to give words from the gods that were unfriendly to the king. Those were to be reported too, and there's even an example of someone sending in a report on just such an encounter. A man named Nabu Ushalim sent a letter in December of the year after the treaty went out to Esarhaddon, revealing that the mayor of the ancient city of Ashur, Abdeh, had pulled him aside to tell him of a pair of dreams that he had, quote from Frahm again. In the first dream, Abdeh reported a child had risen from a tomb and handed him a staff, saying, "Under the protection of this staff, you will become mighty and powerful." In the second dream, Abdeh had suddenly caught sight of a star flaring up in the dead body of the father of the king. Frahm goes on to note the similarities to a prophecy from our old friend Balaam, him with the talking donkey, in Numbers 24, quote, "What I see for them is not yet, what I behold them will not be soon. A star rises from Jacob, a scepter comes forth from Israel." In the mentions of the rising star and an emerging staff or scepter, these verses, while part of what are often considered rather ancient Israelite prophecies, seem to have an exilic element to them, dreaming of a day when a new, powerful Davidic king will arise. And so many first-century apocalyptic Jews, including Christians and followers of Bar Kokhba, absorbed and recontextualized these verses to refer to their own new preferred Yahwistic king. And it does seem to have been part of some pretty formulaic prophecy of a rising king. This might have just been imagery that was common. But in the case of Esarhaddon's hopeful replacement, the insurrectionist mayor of Nimrud, this did not turn out well. The king's spy network had functioned as his treaty hoped it would. If the king pursued the case, it seems likely that the mayor was executed. Deuteronomy 13, on the other hand, demands similar repelling of diviners and prophets who provide divine words that don't fit with the official program. Quote, "If prophets or those who divine by dreams appear among you and show you omens and portents, and the omens and portents declared by them take place, and they say, 'Let us follow other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them,' you must not heed the words of these prophets, or those who divine by dreams. For Yahweh your God is testing you, to know whether you indeed love Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul." So that reflects the difference in concerns for the author, writing at a time after Yahweh had been deemed the only God who is to be worshipped, and he was apparently the kind of God who would give false positives on omens to test you. But while Esarhaddon merely demands a report of the uttered words and leaves investigation and punishment of the offense to the state, the author of Deuteronomy tells his audience to take matters into their own hands. Quote, "If anyone secretly entices you, even if it is your brother, your father's son, or your mother's son, or your own son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your most intimate friend, saying, 'Let us go serve other gods, whom neither you nor your ancestors have known,' any of the gods of the peoples who are around you, whether near you or far away from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you must not yield or heed any such persons. Show them no pity or compassion, and do not shield them, but you shall surely kill them. Your own hand shall be first against them to execute them, and afterward the hand of all the people. Stone them to death for trying to turn you away from Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel shall hear and be afraid, and never again do any such wickedness." So that's a little less fun and more overtly violent than Esarhaddon's snitch web. And we also see the way that the text emphasizes only sticking with authorized cult officials who follow the specific theology of Deuteronomy. Only the one God is to be worshipped. And that theology seems to have cast Yahweh in the role of the Assyrian emperor. The way divinity and the supernatural was conceived was very specific to the time period these texts were written in. The gods, often led by a particular high god like Yahweh, would be seen as ruling over a divine court, as we've discussed a bit in past episodes, and in this case we have a direct analogy made between the king of Assyria and the king of the gods, Yahweh. One of the intriguing aspects of the biblical law codes is this shift from a code given by the king on behalf of the gods to a code directly given by the high god. That seems to be a particular and unique innovation of Deuteronomy and the Torah, one informed by the coming destruction of Jerusalem. There would be no king in those days, as the author of Judges repeats, and so direct communication with the divine and without a king took a special place. With no king in the land, outside of the wicked foreign emperor, of course, prophets who claimed to speak on behalf of Yahweh and who appear to have devoted fans that wrote their words down asserted a special kind of authority, replacing the king's scribes and functioning as emissaries of their patron god on their own. Esarhaddon's scribes put out the words of the king with state authority, and here the scribal class puts out the words of the divine king himself, with divine authority backing them. And so, if we put ourselves in the minds of those writing after the destruction of Jerusalem, we can see how the political structures of the 7th century helped to inform much of the way the later writers related to their God. It's kind of like how Jesus will be compared in some ways with Roman emperors in his apocalyptic return as a conquering Caesar. These specific quirks of history place a lot of these texts firmly in very specific time periods with their associated understandings of the world at the time. In Deuteronomy's case, it also adapts a couple of other elements from its likely source text in Esarhaddon's oath treaty. Especially notable are the curses for breaking the treaty. Like inscriptions in the past, which contained curses and bad fortune from the gods for anyone who altered them, found famously at the end of the book of Revelation, this text also invokes the gods' powers to be directed at anyone who changes the oath, attempts to overthrow, or otherwise fails to give full love and support to Ashurbanipal upon his ascension. The text goes through a wide variety of gods, around 24 or so named specifically, but there's something interesting in this particular selection. Quote, "May sin, moonlight of heaven and earth, clothe you with leprosy. May he forbid your entrance before the gods and the king. Roam the steppe like an onager or a gazelle." And here's Deuteronomy 28:27. "Yahweh will strike you with the Egyptian inflammation, with hemorrhoids, boil scars, and itch, from which you shall never recover." So there's a parallel there, promising skin disease. But let's look at the next passage in Esarhaddon's treaty. Quote, "May Shamash, sunlight of the heavens and earth, not hand down a just judgment for you. May he take away your eyesight. Walk around in darkness." And the next bit from Deuteronomy 28. "Yahweh will strike you with madness, blindness, and dismay. You shall grope at noon as a blind man gropes in the dark. You shall not prosper in your ventures, but shall be constantly abused and robbed, with none to give help." So we have skin disease followed by blindness. From there, the segments diverge a little bit as Deuteronomy skips Ninurta's curse. Quote, "May Ninurta, foremost of the gods, fell you with his ferocious arrow. May he fill the steppe with your blood. May he feed your flesh to the eagle and the vulture." But then it picks up on the curse of Venus. Quote, "May Venus, brightest of the stars, cause your wives before your eyes to lie down before your eyes in the lap of your enemy. May your sons lose control over your estate. May a foreign enemy divide up your possessions." That's right. Venus is going to cause your wife to be fucked by the enemy, and your entire house and estate will be ruined. Deuteronomy takes this up and expands on it, following the blindness curse, and gives it the perspective of a subject people that fears deportation by the empire. Quote, "If you pay the bride price for a wife, another man shall enjoy her. If you build a house, you shall not live in it. If you plant a vineyard, you shall not harvest it. Your ox shall be slaughtered before your eyes, but you shall not eat of it. Your ass shall be seized in front of you, and it shall not be returned to you. Your flock shall be delivered to your enemies, with none to help you. Your sons and daughters shall be delivered to another people, while you look on, and your eyes shall strain for them constantly, but you shall be helpless. A people you do not know shall eat up the produce of your soil and all your grains. You shall be abused and downtrodden continually, until you are driven mad by what your eyes behold. Yahweh will afflict you at the knees and thighs with a severe inflammation, from which you shall never recover, from the sole of your foot to the crown of your head." And from there, the curse in Deuteronomy transitions away from Esarhaddon's curses and into curses that are very clearly written to reflect the Babylonian exile that's still the better part of a century away from us. Instead of discussing a potential curse, it has been altered to talk about what actually happened to the Judahite people. So we see how this kind of scribal production works, even if the specifics of what version of the treaty they were looking at and when this made its way to the scribes of Deuteronomy has been lost to us. The order of the curses and the specificity and the overall structure could be from a similar treaty of some kind, but with how widespread Esarhaddon's oath text was, and given the fact that Judah was a helpful and obedient vassal at the time, it doesn't seem too far to say that they probably received a copy of the treaty, translated it into Hebrew, or it was already in Aramaic, and then when a later scribe was writing Deuteronomy, he took inspiration from this important text that harkened back to the good times, adapting the oaths for his own purposes, but slotting it into the grand treaty of Emperor Yahweh instead of Esarhaddon. Because in the minds of these authors, that is who they wanted to emphasize that their people and kings had betrayed. They hadn't broken Esarhaddon's treaty. They were good subjects, after all, so it must have been Yahweh. Of course, the reality, as we'll see in a couple episodes, is that later Judahite administrations, under immense pressure and during chaotic times, did screw up pretty badly in their handling of regional politics. But for now, we're in a time where things are actually looking a bit better. Judah, despite Sennacherib's destructive campaign and reduction of their borders, was recovering a bit under Manasseh, and it's possible that they received favorable treatment in exchange for assisting in Esarhaddon's next big move. After securing the future of the Assyrian throne, he decided it was time to go back for another shot at Egypt. This time, however, the military planners went for a riskier strategy. Instead of following the sea road, they would surprise Egypt by cutting south through the Sinai Peninsula. And so they set out. The king got all his gear ready, led his forces west, and then he decided to switch to a support class role. Okay, sorry, that's not what happened. Actually, an omen was received that he simply had to stay behind and pray to the moon god Sin. And in fact, the diviner says that if we follow along with these orders, we'll actually take Egypt this time. So instead of joining the treacherous campaign south, Esarhaddon hung back at Haran, a city in modern-day Turkey near the border with Syria, north of Raqqa. Yes, that's right, he didn't even make it west of the Euphrates. But prayers are just as important to a successful campaign, right? Every group needs a moon cleric, after all. His army continued without him, first stopping on the Phoenician coast to kick Tyre in the ass again and installing another puppet ruler, then proceeding into Samarina, as their province was now called. Manasseh would be specifically mentioned as supplying later Egyptian expeditions by the Assyrians, but it's unknown whether troops and material support were provided by the vassal state on this particular run. Regardless, the troops soldiered on from Samaria to Rapihu. That's ancient Rafah on the Gazan coast, a port city whose history stretches back into the late Bronze Age, and which has been the site of repeated massacres of civilians and refugees by the modern state of Israel over the last 80 years, most infamously last year in 2024. From this storied trading port, Esarhaddon's forces, minus the king, made a beeline south to the Sinai, and then turned 90 degrees toward Egypt. The Sinai is one of those liminal spaces that we've discussed a few times on the show, vast wilderness with little population, where mythological stories would often be set. These were places of primordial chaos where gods and other spirits and high strangeness might still appear. It was not the domain of civilization and order. Esarhaddon's annals of the campaign, seemingly supplied with accounts from the people who, were actually there, are worth discussing a bit. Here's a bit from Frahm's book, quote, "Some areas, they state, were full of two-headed snakes whose venom, or touch, is deadly, and yellow snakes spreading their wings. These were most likely not actual animals, though. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing some 200 years later about the same general area, claimed to have seen large numbers of bones of winged serpents there, and both he and Esarhaddon may have been alluding to the fossilized amphibian remains found at sites such as Maktesh Ramon in the southern Negev. Yellowish in color, some of them look as though they might have wings." End quote. And so we can even see some of the ways that this kind of mundane oddity would grow into wild tales over time from the imaginations of frightened travelers trekking through unfamiliar desert wilderness. But the army made it to the other side of the wasteland, likely with the help of Arab tribes. I mean, Esarhaddon was pretty good at negotiating them after all, and it seems implausible that the Assyrians had any kind of adequate supply lines or experience that far west to sustain themselves without Arabian assistance. What they found was Egypt caught with their pants down. It turns out that they had no real ability to defend the roads from the Sinai, and after steamrolling over military outposts and easily repelling attacking Egyptian forces, the Assyrian forces were able to march straight into the ancient capital of Memphis without much fighting at all. They got to Memphis at such a rapid pace that while Pharaoh Taharka was able to flee south up the Nile, his family was not so lucky. Most of his harem and wives, including his royal wife, were captured. Some of his children, including the crown prince, were captured. Upper Egypt's claim over the north crumbled in a matter of days and weeks. It must have seemed a different kind of surreal after the desert traversal to see the Great Pyramids of Giza in the distance and then simply take their great city without even a siege. Esarhaddon's prayers had apparently worked. The Assyrians took Lower Egypt and the Nile Delta from the southern Nubian rulers. They immediately set to work on establishing strongholds throughout the region, building outposts and, of course, looting the shit out of everything in sight. Statues, gods, precious metals, ebony. They started sending it all east to Nineveh. But Esarhaddon's administration knew they also had to win some kind of hearts and minds appeal with the locals to be able to hold northern Egypt. They installed local elite families in important positions and did the whole "we'll be greeted as liberators" things in their propaganda. We're not taking over from the Nubians. No, definitely not. We're installing a local guy called Necho as king, you see. Yes, you'll be paying taxes and tributes. Yes, we're taking Necho's son Psamtik back to Nineveh for safekeeping and insurance, but you're definitely being liberated from those pesky southern black pharaohs. Needless to say, this arrangement, if it had any fans at first, spurred many in elite Egyptian circles to immediately start figuring out how they could exploit this situation to a better end for themselves and presumably the people in northern Egypt. Why stop at getting rid of the Nubians? With how far Assyria is away, how about we take our native land for our own native elite class? But for the moment, Assyria had finally pulled off something kind of bonkers. Rome never managed to get Persia, Napoleon never managed to get Russia, and Afghanistan was pretty infamously the graveyard of empires, but Esarhaddon had passed through the Sinai and taken Egypt, or at least his armies did. The empire's officials celebrated by demanding recognition of the conquest throughout the Mediterranean, sending letters kindly requesting gifts and acknowledgement of their claims over Egypt along the northern coast of that great sea, as far west as modern Spain. Assyria had added yet another enormous prize to both loot and tax. Their connection to the distant west was unlocked and significantly improved, at least in theory. On the other hand, and more importantly, this new distant stretch of land and humans required constant management and attention. If one wants to see what might have happened to any of those other empires had they managed to stretch beyond their boundaries and conquer their distant targets, well, the next half-century should be pretty goddamn instructive. While I doubt Esarhaddon was able to even comprehend the can of worms he'd just opened, he was, for other reasons, completely unable to enjoy the victory of his own campaign. He headed back to Nineveh, having defeated Egypt remotely by, of course, doing his part in praying.
Well, my work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
Didn't I?
But the king got home from his not terribly distant journey and sulked instead. Possibly already suffering from constant illness, he was prone to bouts of depression that saw him sitting in a dark room for days at a time, like an Iron-Age Howard Hughes. His physicians would urge him to come get some sunlight and have a meal, but he seems to have defied all of their orders. And then something even worse happened that spring in 671, something that demanded immediate attention. A complete solar eclipse. The king's diviners and advisors sprung into action, informed the king, and readied what's called a substitute king ritual. A complete eclipse was a sign that the gods were greatly displeased. In times where the gods became upset and provided some kind of foreboding omen or plague on the land, it was thought that the king might be targeted by the pantheon as divine retribution. I mean, it makes sense after all. The kings were closely tied to the powerful royal temples, often sitting on hilltops that reached up toward the heavens where the gods lived in the sky. A man with that much divine authority and that kind of closeness to the gods simply must also bear much responsibility for any problems related to divinity. Many centuries before, clever occultic officials had figured out a way to appease the gods, though. Simply kill the king. But not the real king, no. That would cause too many issues. I mean, sometimes folks killed the real king, but this ritual helped to try and avert that nasty option by getting consent from the real king to assuage everyone's concerns. Instead of the king, someone was selected to become the king a few months before being, well, the ritual doesn't spell it out, but I think you can guess what happens at the end. Oftentimes, but not always, it was just a random person of no renown, like the great Soviet space dog Laika, who was pulled off the streets to see the stars before tragically dying from heat exhaustion in low Earth orbit. The selected person would be crowned as king, receive a harem of women, eat the finest foods, and engage in some semblance of political ritual decisions, presumably decisions that were mostly of no consequence. And then after a few months, they go away, so to speak. And the old king fills the void and resumes his time on the throne. So it was with Esarhaddon and the first of several substitute kings he would send to the great beyond over the last years of his life. These rituals included one to protect his son, ruler of Babylonia Shamash-Shemu-Ukin, in which a man named Dongki, the son of a prominent and wealthy Babylonian temple administrator, was given the poison crown for several months before Shamash-Shemu-Ukin was restored to governance. Some scholars have posited that this last ritual was specifically and cynically targeted at a member of the Babylonian elites. Perhaps despite rebuilding the city, Esarhaddon still harbored some of his father's hatred for the Chaldeans in the south, and decided to choose a prominent family son for a darkly honorific execution, perhaps the most poisoned chalice of them all. And in this case, it was not a ritual done because of some solar eclipse. This was just one because of his paranoid superstition. In these constant rituals, his perpetual withdrawal into literal darkness and weeks without eating or appearing to the public, and Esarhaddon's abdication of his job of joining the conquering troops, all of this inspired attempts at his removal by conspiring elites, likely furthering his paranoia as his spy networks reported the discovery of these plots, including at least 3 in 671, the same year he had finally conquered Egypt. The guy conquered Egypt, and it turns into the worst goddamn year of his entire life. The first of these conspiracies was in Haran, the city the king had just left, where he'd prayed for the success of his conquest. The second was in Nineveh, though it was at the house of Haran, the temple of the moon god Sin, who had featured so prominently in the campaign's grand achievement, and possibly, Frahm notes, the very temple in Nineveh where Esarhaddon's father Sennacherib had been assassinated in our last episode. Worse, the head coup plotter seems to have been the king's chief eunuch, one of the highest-ranking officials in the entire empire, and someone who likely had been a crucial commander in the just-concluded Egypt campaign. Things could not be going worse. At least one more took place later in the year, this time at Assyria's ancient capital that bore their patron god's name, and which their kingdom is named after, Ashur itself. This is the kind of thing that would frankly drive anyone insane. I've seen doubts that Esarhaddon was truly more paranoid than other kings, and it's true that a lot of our reconstruction is based on an accident of history where we know a lot about the 7th century and less so about the periods before and after. But it does seem a bit extreme how Esarhaddon is described in contemporary records. The weeks spent in the dark without eating, the constant repeats of the substitute king ritual. I mean, I don't think it's going too far to say he was struggling at this point in his life. In late 671 or early 670, the king, fed up with these plots against him, gathered all of the elites he could find who had been implicated in these plots and had them executed. A letter from his chief physician is included in Fromm's book. Quote, Radner writes, while the criminals who plotted against the king's goodness had been caught up by this very goodness, their betrayal had made all other people hateful in the eyes of the king, as if a tanner had smeared them with fish oil. Rather understandably, Esarhaddon continued to withdraw from public life, and this is where it seems our best evidence is for his alleged paranoia. But then in 669, despite all of these issues, our likely pale-skinned emperor at this point got out of his presumed coffin bed and went on a campaign with his troops to retake parts of Egypt that had begun rebelling against harsh Assyrian vassalage. Yes, that's already started. They already have to go reconquer it. But it wouldn't happen under Esarhaddon. The king fell ill and died only a few weeks after the trek began. He never saw the Nile, never set foot in the land that had occupied such a significant portion of his rule. His corpse was returned to Assyria and buried among his ancestors, and the succession treaty went into effect. His crown prince, Ashurbanipal, would take the throne. Ashurbanipal would, like Manasseh, have a rather lengthy reign, almost 40 years. But unlike the Assyrian king, whose reign will conclude this little mini-series, Manasseh seems to have had a rather uneventful time in office. Olive oil and wine production, both significant exports from the Levant, boomed under his time in office. When Ashurbanipal went on to retake Egypt, something we'll detail more in a couple of episodes, Manasseh is mentioned as explicitly furnishing the Assyrians with troops and supplies. It doesn't seem like he made too much of a fuss, and with Assyria doing decently well in northern Egypt, there was no longer the serious amount of pressure that had always plagued the Levant's existence as a border territory. Once you're just a stepping stone on the journey to the outer reaches of the empire, your state can sometimes achieve a nice balance between the constant attention of being under the ruler's thumb in the middle and the struggles of dealing with competing hegemons on the fringe. But all of this would change, and Assyria and Judah would both fall to Babylon in the decades to come. With that fall, someone had to be held responsible, and Manasseh drew the short straw. And so we bid farewell to Esarhaddon. While his son is famous for having a library and being a book nerd, it seems that he was emulating his father, one of the more fascinating kings in our history. A recluse, a sickly man, and a guy who seems to have been paranoid. He apparently was either brilliant or knew how to pick administrators, or both, because, well, he did it. He got Egypt, for better and, I'd argue, probably for worse. At the very least, his pick of Ashurbanipal would be extremely consequential, as he will be the last so-called great king of Assyria. And along the way, we also saw how specific details from Assyria during his reign, especially his succession treaty, began to inform and influence a scribal class in Jerusalem that will need to explain the chaos that will unfold as this relatively stable century collapses into insanity. On top of this, a tale about a wise court advisor from Esarhaddon's administration named Ahikar would eventually become the inspiration for later stories about characters like Daniel and Esther and a few others. Whether Ahikar was a real guy in Esarhaddon's court or not, it's this period that will form the backdrop for his rather influential tales. More on that in a fair while in the future, a much later episode. We will be living in the shadow of Assyria for quite a while. This three-part series will finish with the beginning of the Great Regional War, even World War, that spelled the end of Assyria and Judah in the late 8th century. But next time, we won't talk too much about Ashurbanipal and the decline of Nineveh. Instead, we'll head back to Jerusalem to focus on Manasseh for a detour into the idea of child sacrifice in both literature and in historical reality. All this and more on the next episode of the Bible Lore Podcast.